So, because for us it's going to be difficult to see each other's slides, do you mind if you do the opening and then we just talk? And we sit in the front?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you feel very lonely?
No, not at all. So can I sit there and do it?
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, friends. Great to see all of you here. My name is Maninder Gill, and I am Director for Social Development in the GP that covers social, urban, rural, and resilience. And the topic of crime and violence both comes under the social development work that we do, but also under resilience, because it's disaster risk management, but also building the resilience of communities. As all of you in this room know, more than those not in the room, that crime and violence is one of the biggest challenges in development. It's one of the biggest pathologies of societies. And unfortunately, as we are doing well as a planet in terms of economic development and poverty alleviation, the crime and the violence is not decreasing, it's not declining. I hope I'm right when I say that, Laura, that if you look at trends internationally, I think we live in a more violent planet, and violence of all types. So that's something which is it's an urgent agenda for all of us working in development. And everyone, all the sectors, everyone who can contribute something to the dialogue has tried to, and that's what we need. This is such a multi-thematic, cross-sectoral area that this is not the preserve of any one discipline. So if you look at the efforts that have been made, they span environmental design to reforming criminal justice systems to community-based work, all sorts of approaches at the community level, and in the field of human development, health, education, and a variety of other initiatives. So everyone is trying to develop some approaches. They're not as cross-sectoral as they ought to be, but I think that's also beginning to happen. And when all of these approaches are being tried, one thing that you grapple with is, if you're a policymaker or a decision maker, or you are a mayor, you are a little bit confused. You want to know what works, why, where, when, how. So building the evidence as to what is worth investing in is really important in a field like prevention of crime and violence. And I'm delighted the role that DIME and the Latin America, given that this has been a problem which has been most starkly felt in Latin America, that the Chief Economist's office in Latin America region have been at the forefront of the research and evidence building on this. And with them, all of us are working with them, whether it's social development or urban, governance, human development, our colleagues working across a whole plethora of sectors. We've been trying to work together, and we need to do a lot more in collaboration with each other, but great work by DIME and the LAC Chief Economist's office in developing some of these, clarifying some of these pathways. And one segment of that is this whole area of the links between labor markets and preventing crime and violence. That's one very promising area. It's been researched, it's been known for a long time, it's been researched a lot, and there are some links, but they need to be better studied, and we need to drill further down into developing some promising approaches. And there was a sense that while there is a link, but vocational training alone and other regular labor market interventions do not have the kind of durable impact that we want to see in order to recommend that be taken to scale. And some of the issues were that it was impacts were more in the short run and not, they disappeared or they decreased in the long run, or they were linked to some forms of employment and not all forms of employment. And most of the research was coming from developed countries and very little from developing countries where we need to use it. So I think there was a phase when there was a lot of fascination with these links, and perhaps that then diminished with time when it wasn't seen to be playing out in practice. More recently, there's again a resurgence in enthusiasm, which will go into during the real discussion today, when with approaches that combine vocational training with also behavioral and mental health perspectives and interventions. So a combination of these, where it's not only training, mentoring, internships, and other conventional labor market interventions, but also the issues like impulse control or emotional self-regulation, attenuation of cognitive biases that can then help prevent violent triggers. And actually, I was thinking that those things are good by themselves, whether they help affect crime and violence or not. Emotional self-regulation and all of the impulse control, a lot of that we could use in the World Bank also, even when the context is not exactly crime and violence. But these are very promising approaches, and I think what we will hear from all of our speakers today, or some of them, and it'll be a diverse set of discussions, presentations, followed by hopefully some time for discussion, is how these can be implemented in environments where there is low capacity, in what is the promise and what is the reason for excitement, and also what are the challenges and problems in actually implementing it on the ground. So this is going to be a very worthwhile hour and a half or so for all of us to invest, because these are, any programming is expensive, and you see for every good program that you see being implemented on the ground, you see a few which you realize was perhaps a waste of resources and effort. And therefore, the more you invest upfront in developing the evidence and then piloting it and then deciding to take it to scale, the better it is for everyone involved. And it's great to see how the evidence is extremely important for policy and operations, to inform policy and operations, and yet we have a number of projects also from which such evidence can emerge. So we do have about a dozen projects around the bank where we are implementing various things, and perhaps we should use them a bit more consciously to test these pilots and these approaches to build the evidence which we can then take to scale. So I'm very excited to be able to learn from this discussion today. I'm a very ardent student in the field, and don't claim to know anything, actually. I was going to say much, and then I realized I don't almost know anything. So we have a list of speakers. We'll start with you, Laura. Laura Kyoda, who is the senior economist in the LAC Chief Economist's office, which I just raved about a couple of minutes ago. So we'll start with Laura, who's going to tell us about the cost of Mexico's war on drug cartels. And then I'll introduce the others as we have them come on stage.
The motivation for this project, this research project, and actually I first started studying prevention, and then I started talking to some of the government, and in particular in Mexico or even in Honduras and El Salvador. And one of the striking features was like there was no budget for prevention. And one of the things I then thought to rethink is like, well, maybe if we put a price, and if we cannot teach, I tell them that there is a cost in terms of GDP, in terms of growth, maybe the Minister of Finance is going to actually pay attention to. Of course, the problem is causality here. You cannot randomize violence, you cannot randomize killings, so you need to be a little bit more creative. And so, in particular, in the context of this presentation, we're actually using as a unfortunate instrument the spike in violence during the 2000 linked to drug cartels. So this is a long project. today we're going to focus specifically on labor market, in part to set the stage, to show which segment of the labor market tend to be more vulnerable to this cost of violence. But it span also other dimensions, including consumer confidence, firm performance, credit, and human capital, from health to education as well. And as I was mentioning earlier, the problem is causality. And there is a much longer version of this talk that is an hour and a half, and 40 minutes are dedicated to justify the instrumental variable. Today, we are going to actually just claim that, and I'm going to try to kind of give you some intuition why that may be the case, that the instrumental variable actually, it's a valid way to generate this plausible exogenous variation in violence, and therefore we are actually able to identify causal relationship. Given this is a short talk, I like to give the conclusion at the beginning and then repeat them again one more time. So in general, what we find is systematically large and negative impact on earnings for all the population. So it seems that the economy really takes a hit when we have these spikes in violence. And we are going to speak to this specific nature of violence. What are the mechanisms at play? Who is actually driving this reduction in earnings? So clearly the formal sector, whether it's in terms of demand, consumer confidence, there are all these linkages in the background, takes a hit. However, what it does, it reduces the demand for low-skilled workers. So if I am a low-skilled worker in the formal sector, I'm the first one let go, or the first one asked to be converted into an informal worker. Mexico is a large informal economy, so that actually happens fairly often. So we have a worker don't exit the labor market, but what they do, they substitute into low-quality job opportunity that may be in the formal sector or reduced numbers of hours. These tend to be concentrated, no surprise, among the people that we consider at risk, youth, and actually low-skill, like secondary education, male workers. The context of Mexico. So what we are going to explore, I mentioned earlier, is the killing and the capture of key cartel operators. And this is called kingpin strategies, when the government goes after the heads of cartel or kind of the key player in the cartel. It's a strategy started during the 90s, nothing new. In fact, we have actually data back to the 90s, but for today's we are going to focus only on the 2000s. And during the mid-2000s, and more recently during the Calderon administration, this strategy was intensified. So it was part of the premise of President Calderon. He ran on this premise that it's going to be tough on drugs. And so the moment they took office, they decided to actually target the head of cartels. Drug cartel are a big business, but what is this violence? It's just few people killed, there are few municipalities. How this compared to other, if you think about conflict situation, if you think about a civil conflict, how this compared to those level of violence? These are just some numbers. Could be an entire talk about the parallel between conflict and violence in Mexico and also in Central America. So we have between 2007 and 2014, we have 164,000 civilians were actually killed during this period. And those don't include the 20,000 that are actually missing. Over the same period of time, you have the 103,000 civilians died during the combined war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Similar, you take one state, there is one state in the strategic position for drug routes in Mexico. The homicide before 2007 was 15. Per 100,000. In 2010 was 189 per 100,000. Just to put this number into context, the WHO conflict level of violence is 30, and so these are way above this level of violence. And again, in comparison to the other two most violent countries outside Iraq, they actually are in Africa, the level of violence is much lower. So again, what we want you to understand that this kingpin strategy unravel, a level of violence that is actually comparable to civil conflict in other contexts. What is the logic behind the identification? So we are going to argue what happens if there is a neutralization. Suppose Maninder is the one who's going to decide whether we are going to get cookie or not after the session or during the session. So I may need to go to the cookie first. So to decide to get to the cookie first, I need to go and kill Maninder. What happens after Maninder get killed? Where are we going to start fighting? Who is going to decide this? And so there is a sense in which in the moment you take off the head of the cartel, there are many things happen. So there are within cartel fighting, but then also the people in the other room know, or next door, they may know that, oh, now the leader of that room is gone, so we can go to the cookie first. And so we can fight across rooms, so across cartel, within cartel, or we may decide to split. So now, some to the one to the left, we are going to form a group, they're going to fight the one to the left. So you have these three, I guess, perfect storm of situation where you have a vacuum of power, and you have essentially in fight within cartel, breaking up of the cartel, and competition for strategic position within the territory, because if you're close to the door, you can get to the cookie first. What we're gonna argue, and actually we provide evidence this is the case, the time and the location, the neutralization is as if we're at random. So is the government is just indiscriminately going after these people, but when they find them and where they find them, it's actually is not under the control. It for sure is not correlated with the level of economic development or labor market that we have in mind. And so we are going to claim, again, there is a 40 minutes version of this that is going to show that actually generate exogenous variation. What is key for us, I have daily data on homicide. I have quarterly data on monthly data on other economic outcome. You need to be the key, and I think Marcus or Eric are going to speak about the importance of data. But the point is you need to have very high frequency data and high quality data to pinpoint, okay, Maninder get killed, what happened 10 minutes after Maninder get killed, to actually measure the impact on labor markets. We are going to look at both short run and long run. And we're gonna, for the dorks in the room, we are gonna use dynamic panel data model. They are kind of messy, but very effective in kind of tease out both long run and short run. So this is gonna be, the identification is gonna be 5 slides or 5 maps. You have 2 versions of Mexico. On the left side, you have a very funny Mexico map that kind of capture in 2005 presence of cartel. And on top of it, overlay a heat map on neutralization. So the heat map tells you where the neutralization happened, and the redder becomes the more neutralization you have in the area. And the funny color that might be too small for this presentation are actually picking up different cartels, and when you have parent areas is where they interact. On the other side, instead, you have just homicide rate for municipality, and the darker is the color, the more violent is the municipality. I'm going to scroll through from 2005 until 2013, and I'm going to show, and you're going to see essentially, the violence exactly erupts where the neutralization intensifies and where cartel tends to overlap. So essentially, it's picking up exactly the fact that you increase competition, by essentially taking off one ahead, 7 more emerge. Just as a summary statistic, we cannot present all the cartel on these maps, but we started with 7 cartel at the beginning of 2000. We end up with 21 at the end of 2010. And so this is 2008, so this was before Calderon. In Mexico, there was a corridor. There is actually a strategic drug cartel corridor that brings drugs to the US. That was fairly red, in part because, again, the strategic position. After Calderon, you see the intensification of neutralization, but also the overlapping of cartel interaction. This is 2010. This is the peak. Actually, the peak is 2012. And this is 2013. So what we have is essentially we actually build this data, both on drug cartel influence and interaction, and also on neutralization. And we essentially mapped all these episodes, and we are going to use this episode to actually measure the cost of violence. This is the last preparatory slide before the results. But essentially what I want to convey that this level of violence are not one-time shock. We saw that, violence explode is very high, but you may think, oh, today I kill Maninder, there is a brawl here, and tomorrow, there is something else here and nothing happens. Instead, here in Mexico, what it seems to be, and you saw from the map, it was fairly destabilizing. So these are the effect of essentially a neutralization on violence over 24 months. And this we control for past level of violence. Again, that's where the dynamic panel data matters. So essentially, this is telling you that over time, even by controlling for the previous month's violence, you still have significant effect on neutralization on homicide, and in a specific homicides, in a specific municipality, increase homicides by 16%. So these are not trivial effects. However, as I mentioned before, violence is not just restricted to a specific municipality, but there is a contagion effect. There is violence here, it spills over in the atrium, it spills over to the MC building. We are going to try to measure some of this spillover exactly by using this notion of relational distance rather than metric distance. There is a very specific reason why we do this, is just because within 50 kilometers you may have many municipalities in urban area, very few in rural areas, so you instead want to adjust for the density of the municipality. And the three levels of spillover that we are going to use, spatial dynamics, are on municipalities. So we are going to look at the effect, when there is a neutralization on the neutralization, the municipality of neutralization, on the neighbors of these municipality, and on the neighbors on neighbors. In the tables, we refer to those as flowers because the first time that I was trying to convey the message, I draw it and it looked like a flower. So since then, it's been redefined or relabeled as flower. But apparently, it has also a technical name, these queen neighbors. So here are the results. Very quickly, this is just the first preview on monthly earnings. So one neutralization in the first quarter induced an increase in homicide of 16%. After 8 quarters, we go up to 31%. So that's a cumulative effect. So for the neighbors of municipality I, you take one neighbors and you look at the average effect, you increase violence in that municipality, equivalent in all the neighbors, of 8%. After 8 quarters, becomes actually double, 14%. Similarly, the average effect on the flowers, on the neighbors of neighbors, is 7%. You go up after 11 quarters, and these are all significant. So whatever is going to be shaded and not appear is not going to be significant. All that I'm reporting is statistically significant and actually economically significant. What is the induced reduction in monthly earning? You can see immediately it's a fairly large elasticity of 1%. And this is only monthly earning in that quarter, and nearly triple by the end of the quarter for the municipality. Double instead for the neighbors and the flower. Keep in mind, the percentage are taking into consideration different denominators. So 1% increase, for instance, in homicide in a municipality is different than 7% increase in all the neighbors. So the percentage is smaller, but because the territory is much larger, it may lead to even more homicide. But we need to use in percentage to normalize the denominator. These are actually the type of response function we are able to draw. There is an implicit assumption that I'm allowing the neutralization to have effect only in this quarter. So these are all conservative estimates. I have also results for more than 1 quarter, but we don't have time to go over theirs. And this is instead a response function for the log earnings. Now we are going to actually look at some of the who suffered the most. When we think about log earnings, okay, we observe these in the general population, but who are those at risk? Who are those that suffer the most from the shock and violence and from the reaction of the formal sector? So these are the same results we had before. Now we are going to look at monthly earning for informal workers. And you can see that nearly doubles the effect that you have for the general population. And also double is the effect of and the effect of earnings that is always negative for males. So you really have, again, the informal sector, and particularly the male workers, bearing most of this cost. Now we are gonna, again, we have many way of testing mechanisms, but here is a summary of some of the core mechanisms. Say, okay, we observe this reaction in earnings, but what's going on? Is there a kind of change? Is this an intensive, extensive market? People exit from the labor market. And what we observe is actually a sharp reduction on number of workers, almost 20% in a municipality, at the bottom of the wage distribution. That means if you have a low skill, for us, minimum wage or salary less than minimum wage means they have clearly a low skill workers. you exit from the market. And that happens almost at the beginning of the quarter and at the quarter 20%, and is sustained and doesn't dips down a little bit by 80%. When you hit the 8 quarters. And again, the other things you need to keep in mind, these are all mutually exclusive. So the effect that you have on the muni, on the flower, doesn't include the one on the muni. So it's really almost additive, and it's a funny additive up. What happened to the informal workers? So now look at, you have an increase on number of informal workers. Clearly, there is a transition from formal to informal. It's not a perfect transition, but they're fairly significant. We don't have significance for the flowers. These things happen, and it's fine. But also what you have, it's a huge increase in part-time workers. So these are not part-times that are like, I'm a lawyer, I decide to kind of work just half of the week. These are low quality part-time jobs, less than 35 hours. In fact, some people call those underemployed, so they're not able to fill up the weekly hours. And you have both an increase in, therefore, in informality, in part-time, and in particular, you have a huge increase of, a significant increase of underemployment, and particularly even less hours for the youth. So it's really telling you that the quality of the job market is deteriorated, and the ones that are kind of unable to keep the quality of the job market participation up are exactly our at-risk youth. So essentially, this is what I just summarized. Why does it matter? Why this is relevant? As Maninder was saying, this is clearly, it's becoming clear that violence is a development issue. These are real numbers in the labor market. If you add up all the earnings, you are actually, lost in Mexico. You can, and that's on the to-do list. You will end up having, a large size of the GDP being lost because of this violence. So why development, and Mexico hardly can be considered, a struggling, non-developing country, why development may not be enough to curb violence, violence is enough to hinder development. So that's the first challenge that clearly we need to pay attention. The other one is that is important to set up the rest of the talk. It's very much the fragility of the labor market opportunity that are available very often to those that are at risk, that tend to be perpetrators of violence. So there is a sense in which if we are trying to see, is there a nexus, and can this nexus be available to us, it's clearly the low quality participation doesn't seem to do the job, because in fact you have most of these people may even find it more attractive to complement some of the labor market participation, low quality, with a legal opportunity. And I'm done.
Thanks, Laura. That was fascinating. I also thought the whole discussion was on preventing crime and violence. I didn't know that I am at risk of getting killed by coming here. We do need to have a chat on, impulse control and emotional self-regulation. So let's have that. So next we have Sarah Heller, who's assistant professor of criminology, University of Pennsylvania, and she'll talk about low-cost interventions to reduce violence, evidence from Chicago experiments.
Thanks so much. And thanks to the bank for inviting me. It's nice to be here. So I actually have to talk at another conference a little bit after this. I'm going to duck out early, but my email is up here. If you have questions that I don't have a chance to answer, please feel free to email me those questions. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a series of experiments in Chicago. Chicago, you might have noticed, is not in the developing world. But let me just sort of frame the situation for disadvantaged youth in the US and places like Chicago to convince you that the evidence here is probably likely to be relevant to thinking about challenges in developing countries. So we've got a black-white graduation gap of about 8 percentage points. Chicago, the 5-year graduation rate for males, not even on time, but the 5-year rate, around the time that these studies are happening is a little under 45%. So not very many of them are graduating. And once they don't graduate, they're in real trouble. 70% of black male dropouts are going to spend time in prison by the time they're in their mid-30s. The problem is not just on the offending side, but also victimization. Homicide kills more young black males than the 9 leading causes of death combined. So these are sort of stark numbers, especially given that this is the US and not even in a developing context. So the conventional wisdom about this tends to be that criminality and violence is really deeply ingrained in places and people. And when we think about the sort of root causes of crime and violence, whether it's disintegrating families, failing schools, challenging neighborhoods, income inequality, these things are really hard and likely very expensive to change, which sort of gives this sense that there's nothing we can do. But I'm going to argue maybe not, that maybe we should be at least a little bit more optimistic than that. And I'm going to tell you about a few different studies in Chicago. All of these are in print, so you can go find them if you're interested in more details than I have time to talk about today. I'm going to talk sort of about two intervention strategies across 3 different settings. And all of them are evaluated with randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. So for those of you who are not researchers in the audience, let me just say a word about why that matters. So we're used to thinking about this in the medical context, where we don't let people have drugs or new medical procedures before we really rigorously test the results of those drugs and medical procedures. When we think about the social policy world, we almost never do that, right? We just sort of give people things thinking that they're probably a good idea based on very little convincing rigorous evidence. And when we do collect some evidence, oftentimes it's tempting to sort of look at people who participate in some program, compare them to people who don't participate in that program, and call that difference the effect of the program. That is not what counts as rigorous evidence, because if you think about it, the people who walk through the door of the program are probably quite different than the ones who don't show up. Maybe they're more motivated, maybe they have families pushing them through the door, but the difference between those two groups is not because of the program, or not just because of the program, there's all sorts of different things. So what doing an RCT does is create 2 groups that you can actually compare, that any difference between those 2 groups is only because of the program, because the difference between the 2 groups is a flip of a coin, right? We're gonna lottery off the slots, and then we can look at the difference between the 2 groups and be totally convinced that the difference there is because of the program itself. So that's the empirical approach we're gonna take to evaluate all of these interventions. After an initial lottery, we're gonna track youth in administrative data, so data on arrests, as well as school and other outcomes like employment. This is particularly helpful in terms of crime because if you ask a kid, you put a kid in a program, while they're in their program, you say, hey, by the way, are you doing anything illegal? You might not get a great answer. Our arrest data is going to get around that because we can measure it administratively. We see everyone who gets arrested in the city of Chicago. So the first intervention strategy is sort of based around an idea of something that we're going to call automaticity. We all make automatic decisions all the time, so if you want to sort of delve into this, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is an extraordinary review of this evidence. These are the kinds of emotional regulation and self-regulation skills we were talking about earlier. So usually it's actually quite useful that our brains act automatically all the time. We would be in real trouble if we had to consciously think about every single behavior we engaged in. Think about, can any of you tell me how many doors you opened today? I suspect not, because we do it automatically. We don't pay attention. If we did have to do that, we would never really get out of our house, right? Thinking about reaching out, closing your hand, twisting to the right or to the left, which way do you want to push? We'd be in trouble if we had to think through all of that. But unfortunately, these kinds of automatic behaviors are not always adaptive. Sometimes we get it wrong. I do this all the time when I push instead of pull, and then I run into the door. But in that sort of situation, the cost of a mistake is very low. If you're in a situation where your adaptive response is to be fairly aggressive, because that's what's been useful growing up in a sort of chaotic environment and on the street, when someone else is carrying a gun, that kind of automatic response can be incredibly dangerous, right? So the stakes are higher when you have automatic responses that aren't well suited in particular situations. So what the intervention I'm going to talk about first, the Becoming a Man, or BAM, if you will, I didn't name the intervention, it's not my intervention, is sort of, the core idea is to reduce automatic behavior. So through the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, we're going to try to teach kids to slow down and think a little bit more carefully about the situation they're in to make sure their behavior matches the situation they're in. So there's an in-school and an after-school component. Kids get pulled out of school once a week to go for a 27-week curriculum. It's a group intervention. To give you just a sort of flavor of what this looks like, I'm going to tell you about the fist exercise, which is one of the first things kids do. So I don't know if let's see if there's a pointer here. There's Tony DiVittorio in the background. He's the developer of the curriculum. So Tony will have a room full of boys and have them pair up as one of the first things they do, and say, all right, everyone on the left side of the pair, close your fist. Everyone on the right side of the pair, your job is to get his fist open. There's only one rule. There are no rules. Go. So you can imagine what happens in a room full of adolescent boys who have just been told there are no rules. All hell breaks loose, right? They're beating each other up, they're running around. Tony blows the whistle, lets the other person close his fist, so there's sort of equal opportunity bashing going on, and then they come back. And Tony says, how many of you succeeded in getting your partner's fist open? And sometimes a few people raise their hand, and he'll say, what kind of strategies did you try? And they'll say, well, I grabbed for the wrist, but then I missed, so I went for the kidney punch, and then he ran away. And Tony says, interesting. How many of you asked your partner to open his fist? And there will be crickets, right? No one ever asks anyone to open their fist. And he says, well, why not? And the kids will say, well, he would have thought I was a punk. He wouldn't have done it. And Tony says to the other person, is that true? And sometimes the kids say, well, what do I care if he would have, if he asked, I'll open it. It's just a fist. It's just a game. And so this sort of starts a discussion about how you know what other people are thinking, how you know how they'll react, and how to get the things that you want and the assumptions you make about that in particular contexts. So you can see this is a really engaging way to get adolescent boys to start thinking about their own thinking and thinking about how that interacts with other people's thinking. And then they get a homework assignment to go out and ask someone for something they want, and they report back on how that went. So these are the sort of flavor of the activities. There's a whole set of activities that are sort of based around CBT principles to get people to think more carefully about the situations they're in and how they should behave in those situations. There's an after-school component with non-traditional sports, things like karate and weightlifting and boxing. All the coaches are trained in the BAM curriculum, so they're teaching those same lessons through sports. And we're going to take a little over 2,700 7th to 10th grade boys on the south and west sides of Chicago, so those are very high violence areas, and randomly assign them to the program or not. Here are the basic results. So I'll draw your attention first to the one in the middle here, which is violent crime. The blue bars are the program year, and the red bars are the year after the program. So you can see here the way to interpret this is there's about 8 fewer arrests per 100 participants, which is a 44% decline in violent crime. So that's a huge drop in violent crime during the program that then fades out the year after the program. Although the thing about violence is it's so socially costly that we still might be making a good investment even if it fades out. I'll show you that in a minute. So no effects on drug crime or property crime, but other sort of minor crimes decrease by about the same amount. And that basically lasts through the second year. It sort of slips on the other side of statistical significance, but still basically the same decline. Over here in school engagement, we see a big increase both in the program year that lasts and if anything gets a little bit bigger in the second year. So we're tracking now whether that's going to lead to improved high school graduation, which could then have sort of follow-on crime effects. We know that high school graduation is protective for crime in the future. So this is very exciting, but it's only one RCT. You should never make policy based on just one study. So we've actually done a second RCT of BAM and a few years later and found basically similar results. So they stretched the curriculum over 2 years for this part of the program. After the second year, things look very similar. Increase in schooling engagement, decrease in violent crime, and we're gonna keep following them to see how long that lasts. We've also evaluated a different CBT-based intervention, so it doesn't look like BAM, but it's still based around the same principles in the Juvenile Detention Center in Chicago. So these are the kids most involved in crime and violence in Chicago. And we see there also a behavioral response, about a 21% reduction in readmission to the detention center. So it looks like there might not be some exact secret sauce to sort of doing this, but we see behavioral responses across multiple settings. And it might not even need to be CBT per se. So I've also evaluated a summer jobs program in Chicago that's called One Summer Chicago Plus. In the first year, it was an 8-week program. Kids work for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week for a minimum wage. Everyone gets an adult job mentor, so someone whose job it is to sort of help them get over their barriers to employment, make sure they're succeeding, and potentially importantly, help them mediate conflicts in the workplace if they have conflicts with their supervisor. Half of the youth also got some CBT-based curriculum, although I'm going to show you the results for everybody because it turns out whether or not you got the CBT, the results are basically the same. So it looks like the jobs part of the program with the mentor is doing basically the same thing as including some CBT. And a pretty similar population here, high schoolers, a little over 1,600 high schoolers in the Chicago public schools. So the top here are just treatment and control means. If you look at the bottom, these are the treatment effects. This is after 16 months. We see again about a 43% decline in violent crime, so 4 fewer arrests per 100 youth after 16 months. And no significant declines in other types of crime. This all seems to be concentrated on violence. So importantly, these effects don't look to be just incapacitation. So for a summer jobs program, you might wonder, does this just happen over the summer? And then after that, everyone goes back to what they would have been doing otherwise? That turns out not to be the case. Even if you throw the summer data out of the sample, you still see a significant decline in violence that accrues over the course of the next year. So kids are taking something with them that they're learning from the program that's decreasing their violence. Similarly, in the BAM study, it's not just because kids are busy after school. We can see the date on which kids are arrested, and the effect is not concentrated on the days when the after-school programs were offered, right? We also see the effect on the other days. So we interpret this as at least sort of highlighting a potential role for this automatic decision-making and training kids to make less automatic decisions. Obviously, these are bundles of interventions. There's lots of other things that could be going on in terms of mentorship, in the case of jobs, employment, changing peer networks potentially, although lots of other programs have some of those same elements and don't seem to be having these results. So we think that's another sort of flag that maybe it has to do with the automatic decision-making. So if we want to think about what we can conclude so far, and this research is ongoing, these programs really look like an incredibly worthwhile investment. They are not high cost as these sorts of programs go. So BAM costs about $1,100 per participant in the first year. The detention center version is even cheaper because the building and the kids and the staff are already there. You just have to change what they're doing during the day. Jobs are a little more expensive because you're paying wages, but not that much more expensive. And so if you assign costs to the crime, so right, crime has social costs. People spend a lot of time and energy trying to estimate how much that is. You saw Laura do a different version of that just before. It looks like the benefits outweigh the costs, maybe as much as 50 or 70 to 1. So this is an incredibly smart investment. Even if the violence decline doesn't last any longer than we've sort of seen it, we're still getting $50 to $70 back in terms of social costs for every dollar we spend. That's a great investment. And then sort of more broadly, we can also notice from this that it might not actually be as hard to reduce violence as we thought, right? When we sort of think back to the root causes story, the things that are really hard to change, these are very low intensity interventions. So on average, kids attend 13 BAM sessions, that's it, and we're still seeing these effects. So that I think is a much more hopeful message than a lot of sort of other research in this field. And then the last point I will make is that these are all interventions for adolescents. So in the world where so much policy attention is focused on the importance of early education, which it should be, early education works. It is also an incredibly cost-effective intervention. We should be doing more of it. But we don't need to just give up on adolescents because we see here that pretty low-cost interventions can effectively reduce violence for those kids. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. You now have Laura Murray. Do we have Laura?
Yeah, she's going to be.
Oh, okay. She's assistant professor in the Department of International Health, Center for Refugee and Disaster Response at Johns Hopkins. And she's going to talk about evidence on the role and potential impact of skills development for at-risk youth in low and middle income countries. Laura, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Great.
Can you, do you have slides?
Yeah.
She does. And can you see them? She can. Okay, super. Very good. Go ahead, Laura.
And so you're able to see the slides now? Is that right? You're all able to see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I apologize that I cannot be there in person. I'm just back from a long trip and couldn't get there in time. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the evidence of also cognitive behavioral therapy and some work in low and middle income countries. So So I'm sure people in the room are quite familiar with this, so I'll go through it quite quickly. But the World Report on Violence really highlights public health consequences of violence and does include in this psychological effects. The psychological effects are things that we normally think about: trauma, anxiety, depression, suicide, but also there's a real behavioral component. So substance use, engagement in high-risk behavior, less productivity in work, and that would all fall sort of under the rubric of mental and behavioral health broadly. So in low and middle income countries, in global mental health, which includes behavioral health, we often talk about the treatment gap. And this is really just data that suggests over 75% of those worldwide do not receive treatment. And that certainly includes a large number of people that are experiencing or perpetrating violence. The treatment gap for children and adolescents is even more extreme, with about 0.16 of them receiving actual treatment in low and middle income countries. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy, which you just heard about. For those of you that aren't as familiar with it, it's a big word for just focusing on the relationship between what we think, our emotions, and then our actual behaviors. It's time limited, and it's used for a wide range of mental health problems and behavioral problems. And it really is evidence-based, not evidence-informed, but truly evidence-based. So the World Bank report actually in 2015 highlighted what we think actually looks just like CBT. So paying attention to how humans think and really looking at behavioral patterns, human choice and action. So I was asked to talk first a little bit about how do we actually implement CBT in low resource settings. That's one of the first questions. Is it sounds complicated. Many people in high-income countries are very highly trained that implement this. So it really came about in global mental health in low-resource countries where there's a real lack of any mental or behavioral health professionals. And so there's a movement called task shifting or task sharing approach, which the World Health Organization promotes, and it's all about training lay counselors. So these are counselors with none, usually little to none, mental health training, and often very limited education. So something similar to a high school. So how are they actually trained? And this is just to highlight a paper, if you are interested, from the International Journal of Mental Health Systems about how we actually do this in the world of global mental health. So we talk about the apprenticeship model. So this is just similar to apprenticeship, like with carpentry or plumbing. It's a process over time where you learn from very hands-on. So what you'll see here is on the left of your screen, we do an in-person training. This is actually the smallest part. Most often in low-resource countries, they're still following processes that we call train and hope, which means you come in, you train, often very didactically, and then you leave. And research shows that is almost definitively absolutely ineffective and a complete waste of resources. So although it's seemingly cheap, your outcomes will model that. And so what we've sort of decided is we've come up with a process where after the in-person training, they have practice groups, which is done locally with a supervisor and about 5 to 6 counselors. And then as they move into seeing real groups or real individuals, they move into supervision groups. What you'll see here, which I'm also going to highlight on the next slide, is that the cultural modifications of any evidence-based treatment in mental and behavioral health happens by the local people. And so whatever group of lay counselors we're training, they're the ones that make the cultural modifications as they're going through practice groups and actual supervision groups. And that is, again, something we've learned over the past decade, that it's largely ineffective and sort of silly for us to assume that we can adapt any sort of intervention before we actually get there. And so this is just a model of how it's constantly built in, where trainers, supervisors, and counselors are all in constant contact, but the counselors and the supervisors are really feeding back constantly how the treatment may need to be modified. This is an example of a study I'm going to show you in Iraq, in southern Iraq, where you see the people standing are local supervisors, and they're helping their counselors put together a common elements treatment. It's very hands-on. So I know we don't have much time, and I'm trying to squeeze a lot in. It's harder not being there in person. I hope that I'm managing to capture your attention still. So I'm going to talk next about some randomized controlled trials of CBT in low and middle income countries. And so I'm going to start by with a child study, and this is actually a study we did in Zambia. And again, the providers are from the community. They're from the actual poverty-stricken communities. They have very limited education. We worked with a population of what's classified as orphans and vulnerable children, ages 5 to 18, and we compared a trauma-focused CBT compared to treatment as usual. You know, just a sort of a brief discussion about low and middle income countries and violence. In our experience, these are settings where most kids are not in school. Most families can't afford to send their kids to school. And the amount of trauma and stress we find is incredibly high. So many of these kids, their parents have died from HIV. They're orphans, obviously. They have their own HIV, the mother-to-child transmission on top of what's happening with adolescents is very stressful, as you can imagine, being a young person living with HIV and trying to maneuver through dating and relationships and things like that. And as you can imagine, in low-resource countries, there's also a situation where drinking, substance use, has a huge impact on violence. And, you know, they sort of talk about drinking as there's not much else to do. It's the only thing that, you know, sort of makes me a man. And so there's a lot of violence and overlap we see with trauma and stress just that's existent in low-resource countries. So in our trial in Zambia, as you can see, the effect size is almost ridiculous. It's a 2.4, which is extremely high for effect sizes. In mental health, we would consider an effect size of 0.8 to 1 very high. So this is TFCBT compared to waitlist control. Actually, this treatment is usual for orphans and vulnerable children. So extremely effective treatment. I also just wanted to highlight the amount of violence we see, the interpersonal violence of hit, kicked, punched, or at home, witnessing domestic violence, beaten up, shot at, threatened. It's bordering on, you know, 75 to 80% for some of those. And this is people who actually report. What we find out clinically as we go through is that these percentages are actually even higher. So, for example, you'll see sexual abuse at the bottom is a little bit less than 20%. And in our actual clinical files, we find that that's quite a bit more. It's almost 50%. So you just see a reporting bias. So what's the summary of youth mental health? There's actually not many trials in low and middle income countries. Most of the evidence is gathering around CBT-based principles. There is growing evidence that non-specific interventions are not effective. So there's some studies there that I highlight on that. So some recent adult trials, we also work with adults, and the study I'm going to highlight is adults that were victims of torture in northern and southern Iraq. So obviously massive amounts of violence. Many were former political prisoners. And we trialed a number of different interventions, two that what we call single disorder treatment. So cognitive processing therapy is built for trauma, and behavioral activation is built for depression. You see the second yellow bullet point has a non-specific counseling intervention. That's very typical in low and middle income countries, sort of non-specific things, interventions. And then the last one is a common elements approach, which I want you to pay attention to, because I'm actually going to talk to you about that being a much more economically sound decision in low and middle income countries, moving to common elements rather than single disorder focus. So same outline, low trained community workers, everything's done in the community. This, of course, was adults. So what you see here in this graph, and I'll try to leave it up just a tad longer so you can digest it. The really long yellow lines you see stretching out, that's your common elements treatment. So what you see is a common elements treatment, which I'll give you more information about in a minute, performed much better than the single disorder treatment. So we had cognitive processing therapy, which is a trauma-focused therapy, single disorder, meaning that people only learn how to treat PTSD, did not perform well as common elements in any place. In anxiety, trauma, depression, or dysfunction. So what's our summary of adult mental health treatments? There's more studies on adults. Most of them are violence and trauma affected. There's been some really nice meta-analyses and reviews lately. CBT-based treatments are by far performing the best. There is some indication that an intervention may work well in one country and less so in another. So I'm going to end my talk talking more about a health systems evaluation of evidence-based interventions for violence and what's most cost effective. So as you read through all the evidence, what's going to get you better results for your money? So the singular focus of any evidence-based treatments in mental and behavioral health has a lot of problems with uptake and sustainability. So if you can imagine a very limited workforce in most of these places, so if you can sort of picture someone who maybe has a middle school education at best and no mental health training, we are going to expect them to be trained in a treatment for trauma, and then a treatment for depression, and then a treatment for anxiety, and then a treatment for substance use, and then a treatment for aggression and violence, and then a treatment for parenting. So either you need a massive workforce, like we do in high-income countries, or you need these very low-educated community workers to be trained in multiple things, which is very, very high cost. So what we see here is that our singular focus, if we focus only on one thing, really doesn't help us. Just one more comment on the problems. Comorbidity is very common. So when we talk about violence and hearing some of the statistics that Laura put forward, violence is very entangled within trauma and stress and families and culture within low and middle income countries. And it's very hard to disaggregate and separate any of those. They're just too linked. And people present with all sorts of comorbidities. And when you work in some areas of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, you also have physical illnesses, such as HIV, that are really interlocked with all of that also. And so to just try to choose one thing to address is never, I think, going to get you the broad results that we're all looking for. It's just sort of taking that really, really small bite of the pie. So this is a graphic explanation, which honestly I hope makes you all dizzy sitting there in your chairs. I can actually see you guys, which is sort of fun. It's a crazy diagram, but this is actually what happens with all sorts of mental and behavioral health disorders. And you could add adherence to HIV, interpersonal and domestic violence, anything you want. This is called siloed care. And this is what we do in high-income countries because we have a massive workforce and we actually have systems that deal with this. We have residential placement. We have most kids in schools. We have sort of all these other dynamics that are absolutely not present in low and resource countries. So our argument is that we really need a different system. If we build a siloed care, we're never going to get where we want to get with the resources that we have. So what is a modular common elements approach? It's not a new treatment. It's something where you have tools. You take the common elements of every sort of evidence-based treatment and you put them together. You teach them. You teach certain elements. You teach counselors how to put them together. And so they're able to treat multiple mental and behavioral health problems. So it's not a new treatment. This has actually been done quite a bit in the United States and Europe at this point. The reason for this is that when you look at evidence-based treatments, when you look at CBT, every package is actually made of the same elements. They just have different bells and whistles. Packaged differently, it's performed a little bit differently, but there's not a whole lot of, the similarity of elements is widely overlapping. So what does this mean? This means that what you have in this middle gray box is one provider. So if you can imagine a low and middle income country where you're often going to rural clinics that do everything. These rural clinics, treat TB at the same time that they treat HIV, at the same time that they're have a labor and delivery area. So they're doing everything. And you may be able to train one or two community mental health workers in this area, and they cover sort of a wide area. This one provider can learn one treatment, a common elements approach. They're still learning the same elements that are in every other evidence-based treatment, but the teaching is different. We teach elements and how to choose them rather than sort of a set step-by-step manual. The reason for this is that if I'm a provider in a rural area and I only know how to treat trauma, what do we do if someone comes to me with aggression problems? Or a parent says, my kid's beating up other kids. I don't know how to help them. So unless we move to this type of approach, we're going to have trouble. So as I said, there's many others moving to transdiagnostic approaches or common elements approaches. So if you want to look up the literature in the United States, John Weiss, Bruce Trapita, David Barlow with adults, there's a lot of evidence moving in this direction. So some concluding thoughts about all of this. Various cognitive behavioral approaches have been shown to be very feasible and effective in low-resource countries. So it's no longer a question that CBT principles are transferable. They're actually very accepted by other cultures, given our cultural modification process, and they're much more effective than treatment as usual. So that's the first point. The second point is that we know now that lay providers can actually deliver a CBT-based model with fidelity and effectiveness, as long as you use sort of an apprenticeship-type model where they have a lot of hands-on experience. And then finally, a common elements model is showing to be not only effective, as you saw with some of that Iraq data, but really is much more cost-effective to scale up and sustain when you're talking about low-resource settings. So just the last word that we always like to show, a little comic. The latest research shows that we really should do something with all this research. And that's always where we like to end, because I think our struggle is that, again, CBT has shown to be very effective and very accepted. Lay providers can do it, and we know that this common elements approach is highly effective. And again, addresses a wide range of problems that likely feed into violence in low-resource countries. So your substance abuse, of course, your violence and just aggression, but also some underlying principles such as trauma and stress and emotional dysregulation and other things that have been discussed. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Laura. That was fascinating. And actually, the last cartoon slide was going to be my question, and perhaps our discussants can address that, because it seems like something really, there's proof of concept, it's a lot of evidence, can be implemented in low and middle income countries, especially in low income countries. So just to get a sense of what's been the uptake and what are we doing as an institution to make that happen. So next we have Julian Jamieson, is that right?
Jameson, yep.
Okay, who's senior economist at the other GINI, which is the Global Insights Initiative at the World Bank. So on reducing crime and violence, experimental evidence on adult non-cognitive investments in Liberia.
Great, thank you. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. I'm almost tempted to say, because this is such a natural follow-on to the last two papers, just skip to the end and say, yeah, CBT works here too. So that, that's about it. But I'll give you a little bit more. And I guess, as opposed to Sarah's paper, this is going to be in Liberia rather than Chicago, and it's going to be slightly older, so even past adolescence, which is exciting to see. And as opposed to Laura's presentation, which was great, this will be a little bit more on outcomes beyond mental health, so actually showing some of the effects on violence. So Liberia, I don't have to say too much here, but of course the relevance for the Fragility Forum is that there was about 15 years of, I hesitate to even call it civil war. There was just a lot of different people fighting different people there for 15 years. But for the last 10 years, it's been much more stable and trying to redevelop and had this sort of intense shock in the middle and human capital and lots of other things. So it's actually a difficult country to work in, and they're doing what they can. But it's getting better, and it seemed like the right place to go and look and see what we can achieve there. So our population, I'll give you some details in a moment, but these are going to be young men, so 18 to 35 in age, think of that. So not living at home, not going to school, mostly out on the streets, hustling, which is just getting by. That can be legal or illegal work, but just finding something to do to make a little bit of money. This is guys selling small amounts in markets, or they're car loaders, so they can load wheelbarrows and carry them around, help people load their goods onto cars, and some of it is petty theft as well. So they have lots of different jobs. They don't have one steady job. A lot of them don't have a steady place to sleep either. So this is it's an unusual population to work with, but one that's, especially when you think of violence as an outcome, both for themselves and for the community as a whole and neighboring countries, a very relevant population to see if we can make a difference with. So as we heard in the introduction, although compared to the years of the Civil War, maybe violence is lower, but this sort of low-level simmering violence has continued in Liberia, and with the neighboring armed conflicts in Cote d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone, there's been a lot of spillover, a lot of people going to work as mercenaries there, a lot of worries in Liberia that it would back into their country again. Lots of little things getting by on the street. I mentioned some of that. We have a theoretical model in the paper, which I certainly won't go into here, I won't take time on, but we compare sort of licit labor where it takes some capital to start a business. It doesn't have to be very much, and we'll talk about that, but a little bit, as opposed to the illicit labor where you don't need any capital. You can go and a business here might be just pickpocketing or stealing from people, or it might be something where it's manual labor on the street. So our population, more than one crime per week, daily drug use, that's a lot marijuana, but hard drugs as well, and 20% selling drugs. I mentioned the mercenary recruitment, and so that was something that during our study period, which was finished a couple of years ago and started a few years ago, that was a big deal there. So it was something we were very concerned about, is something the government was very concerned about in Liberia and was interested in. So again, I'm not going to go into the theoretical background very much, but say the normal response for an economist. I'm an economist. I should have said the names are up at the beginning. This is joint work with Chris Blattman, who's trained as an economist but in the political science department, and Margaret Sheridan, who's a psychologist. So the usual response for an economist is incentives. Change the incentives. So kind of take the personality. It's he because this particular study is only working with men. We've certainly thought about a version with women. Take the person as they are, and then either the carrots and the sticks. So either provide jobs and economic incentives to do better, or policing on the other side. But just as we've seen in the last couple of presentations, we wanted to see whether there's something else we could do, whether it was more malleable. And this was one nice. I should give credit. The pictures are not ours, but I like this one a lot. Somebody we were working with. So you may have our past. To Satan, you may have our past, but don't mess with our future. So getting people to think about the future and think about changing and thinking about themselves in the future and where do they want to be. And the one other thing, I'll describe the program a little bit, and we refer to it as cognitive behavioral therapy, and I think that's valid, that's accurate, and makes sense in the context of what we've seen. But this was something that was a modification of a homegrown program. So it was not experts. I'm not an expert in CBT. Even Margaret, our psychologist, knows a lot about it, but she's not an expert in that. But certainly the people running the program, and I will give some of the details, they did not know this was CBT. They were not trying to do CBT. They had just developed something that looked like it, and we modified it a little bit to try to narrow the focus. So we call it STYLE, Sustainable Transformation for Youth in Liberia. There's self-control skills, impulse control, so we've heard about that several times today. I think that's quite important, and emotional regulation, planning for the future, and then the self-image component, which is maybe a little bit different from some of what you've heard about so far. So these are really marginalized guys, and they think of themselves as marginalized guys, and all of society thinks of them as marginalized guys. So trying to get them to recalibrate a little bit and think of themselves as, I can be a normal member of society. And so we had some things like, here's a little bit of money, go and buy a Coke in a store that you wouldn't normally walk into, or go into a bank where you wouldn't normally feel comfortable. Dress differently. That was a big part of what we did. So we didn't tell them to do this, but we sort of gave them the option. A lot of them bought a new set of clothes. They would get their hair cut. They would clean off, and so hygiene and things like that. Just thinking of themselves differently and respecting themselves, taking themselves a little bit more seriously was a part of what we wanted to do. So I won't say you've heard a lot about CBT already. I certainly won't give the theoretical background, but the instantiation we have here, this is 8 weeks. They're coming in for either a morning or an afternoon 3 times a week, for 8 weeks in total. In groups of 20, not everybody showed up for sure. So in practice, it was usually fewer than 20 at any given moment. Role playing, discussion. A typical thing would be, where do you want to be in a year, or where do you want to be in a few years? Okay, write down all the steps you need to get there. So I'm just thinking broadly, I want to be a big business success. I'm going to have a lot of money. Okay, well, what are you going to do tomorrow? What are you going to do the next day? What are you going to do the next day? Write that down. Talk to each other about it. Homework, I thought, was a big part here. So getting this feedback. This is a very chaotic environment, especially where they're coming from before. There was not much link in their world between what they do, their inputs and the outputs in some sense. So if we could provide that in a controlled environment to teach them, okay, if you go and do this, then we'll put a gold star up, or we'll announce that. So you do this and you get the feedback in a fairly short time period. We could control that and hopefully get them to learn that was possible more broadly. We did some follow-ups, so the counselors would go and talk to people outside the classroom, if you want to call it that. This is obviously not students. This is not taking place in a school. We found basically at a building, an abandoned building in Monrovia, in the capital. And the only compensation was lunch. So the morning group or the afternoon group would come in early, they'd stay, and they'd have lunch 3 times a week, and that was it. Okay, so importantly, I said a little bit about this. The facilitators who were running the program were a lot former combatants and street youth themselves, so they could talk about this very realistically. They knew where the young men were coming from. We had both male and female facilitators, as you can see, and this was an existing program that originally had come from right after the war, so just reintegration after the war. This was sort of their next stage of that, of getting people to sort of operate a little bit better in society. As I said, we tried to focus it a little bit on, for instance, a little bit less on interpersonal skills and a little bit more on oneself and self-regulation. As an economist, I think of this a lot about time preferences, getting people to think more about the future, getting them to think about their future self and themselves in the future and where they want to be and what it takes to get there. But a lot of the elements of CBT, and we brought in a few more ourselves. Okay, so we have basically 1,000 guys. There were 3 phases, but 1,000 in total. And we randomize 50-50 go through this STYLE transformation program, the CBT therapy, and 50-50 get a $200 unconditional cash grant, and 2x2 design. So there's a control group that gets neither, and then there's the group that gets both together. And our thought going in was, well, maybe, again, these guys don't have access to capital. They don't have a strong network of family and friends. They can't get microcredit. I mean, they can't go and get $40 if they need $40. They have nowhere to get $40. If they absolutely need $40, they can't do it. So I thought, all right, maybe the transformation program is not going to be enough to get people to want to do this, to be thinking about the future. Maybe they need the capital as well to start something. That we were probably wrong about that, but that was our hypothesis going in, and so that's why we wanted to try both versions and putting them together. A little bit of background, so average age 25, some schooling, almost half ex-combatants from the Liberian War. Monthly earnings, so you can see it's about $2 a day. So this is not, by sub-Saharan African standards, this is not the poorest of the poor. These are guys hustling on the street in the capital city. So not a lot of money for sure, but not the very bottom of the pyramid. Sleeping on the street, a lot of them, even the ones who weren't sleeping on the street, are moving around often. They don't have a permanent place to stay. I give you some of the numbers for selling drugs, using drugs, and half reporting to having committed a theft themselves in the past 2 weeks. I won't say too much about the timeline except to say the therapy, for those who are in the therapy came first, cash came at the end of the therapy. So part of the reason for the cash was an intervention itself to see whether this changed behaviors. Part of the reason for the cash was as a measurement device for, did the therapy have an effect? What did they do with the cash? But in any case, it came right afterward. They didn't know about the cash up front when we were recruiting them into the sample. We told them about the therapy and the control group. Even before that, we said, do you want to participate? We're working on this. We didn't say there was going to be this $200 cash. They only found out about it right beforehand. Compliance was fairly high for the therapy. A lot of people came to at least 1 or 2 sessions. The average was probably half or something like that. Compliance for the cash was very high. Actually not 100% because we couldn't find everybody, but it was pretty high. And there was nobody who actually turned down the $200 cash that we found. And we did I'm going to give short-term and long-term data. The short-term data I won't talk about as much, but that's basically 1 month afterward. The long-term data is 1 year after the end of the therapy. Okay, 1,000 total. Okay, I'm not going to go through the numbers here, just to say, and Sarah mentioned this, self-reporting is definitely something we want to take seriously here. Unfortunately, in Liberia, we do not have access to administrative data of any kind about anything, pretty much. So it is self-reported. We spent a lot of time trying to think about this. We did some qualitative interviews. We went and spent time with a subset of them. We thought about how we asked the questions. We actually wrote up a whole separate paper on how we did this. So it's not perfect. It's self-reported. I'll say that caveat up front. But what we did, what we could, and we did some robustness checks to see how much do we think that matters. So I think we believe the results. I'm happy to discuss that with others afterwards. But it is a real issue. Okay, so here are the results. So you have control on the left, and then you have the therapy only, cash only, and therapy plus cash in order for each. And there's so thefts and robberies on the left-hand side for the past 2 weeks. Sold drugs, just as 2 typical. I'll show you an index in a second, so I'm not cherry picking, but just to give you an example of some of them and see what the results look like. And you can see basically in the short run, everything helps, whatever we do, any of the interventions. But in the long run, it's the therapy plus cash together that does the most. It's just not exactly for the reasons that we thought. At least that's our interpretation. I'd be curious to get your thoughts. But we do see some long-run effects. That was what was exciting here, is we do see these big and actually similar orders of magnitude to some of the results you've already seen today, and the sort of 30, 40, even 50% sometimes decreases, which was great, which was very exciting. So here's an index of the all the antisocial behaviors basically that we asked about, so everything's there together. You can see the therapy has a strong effect in the short run. The cash does a little bit in the short run, not very much. That's the third bar on the left-hand side. The two together certainly, and in the long run, the two together have this huge drop. You don't see anything else that's at least statistically significant in the long run. On economic outcomes, so we were also very much hoping that we would see, so they try to start businesses with this money, and that's, that was going to change the environment, hopefully make them less susceptible to mercenary recruitment and other temptations. And in the short run, if you give them money, they have money, they do better, they don't sleep on the streets. That's a great outcome. And they mostly, I don't show the numbers here, but they did very responsible things with money. They did try to start businesses. Some of them paid for training or education of various kinds. Some of them saved it. A few of them, at least a portion of it, they wanted to spend it, and they went drinking and other things, and that's fine. But they spend it quite well, and in the short run they have more money, but in the long run, basically you can see everything's a zero in the long run. That's what you want to look at here for consumption or earnings. So even for the group that was getting both the cash and the therapy, and I think maybe I have a slide. The reason for this is they're getting robbed on average 8 times a year. All their stuff is getting taken 8 times a year. And about half of those 8 times are the police, and the other half are not police. So this is technically what they're doing is illegal because they're selling things on the street. So that's not, it's not allowed, and there's a lot of corruption. So again, I don't think it matters so much that it's actually the police. It's just the point is they tried to start these businesses. As far as we can tell, this is a simplification. They tried to start these businesses. That didn't work. But it gave them this sort of short-run spur of being a little bit better off and thinking of themselves a little bit differently. And we do see these continuing long-run effects on the antisocial behaviors. So it's very disappointing on the economic side, I have to say, and not what we expected, but very encouraging on some of the crime and violence side of things. So from some qualitative interviews, and again, this is just our interpretation, our thoughts, and this would be nice to study further. The idea was what was the extra effect? So the therapy has this effect in the short run, but it's not sustained. In the long run, it's sustained, but only when there's this cash as well. However, the cash doesn't seem to actually be making a difference in the long run in the sense that they're not better off economically after a year. So we think it's this sort of extended practice. It's lengthening the effect of the therapy, and a natural way to test that would be, of course, to compare different lengths of therapy, different amounts of cash, which we would have loved to do, but we haven't been able to yet. So I think partly both the sense of having the money and feeling differently about themselves because of that, because they're feeling rich, they're feeling like they can do something, they have agency, they have control in their lives, and partly just it allows them to stay a little bit longer and go a little bit further in this new way of life. And as it says at the bottom, survive shocks at least for a little bit longer, but apparently not for a year. Okay, so you've already heard about BAM. So in Chicago high schools and juvenile detention centers, as I said, this is slightly older, very high risk, and a little bit more on the image change side, but very similar results, very encouraging to see, and a nice complement to what you heard about earlier today. So that's it. I think it's on the whole it's positive. It's cash transfers again. I know some of you know Chris's work, and Chris is associated with cash transfers left, right, and center, and I've done a little bit of work with him in Uganda as well. But this is one where cash by itself didn't actually do very much. So this is kind of a failure for cash on its own, I would say, both in terms of economic outcomes and these antisocial outcomes. But cash plus the therapy, it mattered. It mattered to have the cash there. It's what made it work in the longer run. And I would also say, and this is again similar to the one period which you heard before, it wasn't a waste. They lived better for a period of time. They used the cash responsibly, even though we don't see these effects sustained at 1 year. It wasn't a waste what they did with the cash, and it wasn't necessarily a waste in terms of sort of social policy to give it out. It just didn't have the sustainable side that we wanted. But cashless therapy did. Crime and violence go down, even if the economic outcomes are not as good. Probably institutional things that are going to be much harder for us to change that mattered, that why the economic side wasn't as successful. And therapy can do well. I don't think I said the number. It might have been on one of the slides. This is about $200 per person for the therapy. So about $200 for the cash, $200 for the therapy, maybe $100 in administrative and overhead costs. We haven't tried to do a full cost-benefit analysis, but that's where the costs were. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Julian. Just another element in the evidence for CBDs. So we'll have our discussions reflect on that. But before that, we have Marcus and Eric. You have 2 presentations. 1, 2.
We're
Okay.
going to abbreviate abbreviated presentations.
Okay. No, just because I don't have a name for Eric, so I thought maybe it's the same. But it's about at-risk youth in Honduras. So.
Yeah. So hey guys, I'm going to try to give a shorter version of a short presentation because we're low on time. But basically, what I want to talk to you about today is ongoing work with the government of Honduras, building on some of the studies that we've heard about so far today, relating to changing the life trajectory of at-risk youth. So this is joint work by the Development Impact Evaluation Team, the Office of the Chief Economist for the Latin America region, the Social Development and Global Practice, and of course our most important partner is the government of Honduras. So, it's customary when we have these kinds of presentations to say, okay, well, what we need is more evidence of what works. But how much or how little evidence do we actually have? Well, if we think about sort of peace building, broadly defined to include things like gender-based violence, jobs for at-risk youth, an organization called 3IE, the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, did a gap map, which is basically a mapping of the available impact evaluation studies across various categories of peace-building interventions. And so what they find is that there are only two categories of intervention where we have sort of sufficient evidence or sufficient number of studies to do some kind of evidence synthesis, draw broader conclusions. 5 intervention categories that have absolutely no evidence, and 18 where the evidence is very limited. So without sort of going into what these different categories are, kind of what can we conclude? So basically, there are very few sort of known knowns. There are quite a few known unknowns, and there are probably quite a lot of sort of unknown unknowns, borrowing from this gentleman. But also, I think Mr. Rumsfeld and his friends provide really, really fantastic illustration of the kind of dangers of faith-based policy versus evidence. But so often, this is kind of what we're left with, right? And I think most of the speakers have alluded to this. We don't really know what works, so we guess. So at DIME, we have a bunch of impact evaluation programs in 8 thematic areas, everything from agriculture to ICT. And one of these programs is called Evidence for Peace, and here we're dealing specifically with issues of fragility, conflict, crime, and violence. Looking at a set of projects, mainly government-run, in 4 themes, So jobs for at-risk youth, in public sector governance, in gender-based violence, and in urban crime and violence. So we're currently running 16 studies in 13 countries, each of these in collaboration with whoever's responsible for the project, typically the government. And so these are 16 sort of living examples of not only using evidence to inform the design of a specific program or policy, but actually using the project or the program as a vehicle to drive further learning. So one of these programs that we're working with is in Honduras, and it's called the Safer Municipalities Project. It's active in 3 municipalities that have homicide rates above the national average. So at the time that this project was conceived, Honduras was the most violent country in the world. They had a homicide rate of 90.4 per 100,000 inhabitants, which is way above the conflict threshold that Laura mentioned earlier in her presentation. That's 30. So this is about 3 times the conflict threshold is one way of looking at it. Or if we want to compare it to other countries, in the United States, the homicide rate is 4 per 100,000. South Africa, it's 10. Nigeria, it's about 10, and in South Africa, it's about 30. So these are really, really high homicide rates. Of course, in every single country, I think, it's not kind of uniform across the population, and in Honduras, it's no different. Homicide does discriminate, and so what we see is that it's concentrated in urban areas. It primarily affects men. 94% of victims are men. And then if we look at sort of the relationship between the age of victims, we see that in the late teens, there's a big jump. The 20s, we have these insanely high rates, and then gradually it declines with age, although it remains very, very high for men throughout their lifetimes. And so sort of natural policy inclination for the government, when faced with a large number of disaffected young men, what they might want to do is say, well, what else can we give these guys to do? How can we channel them into productive occupations and opportunities? And so very early on in our discussions with the government of Honduras on this particular project, this is exactly what came up, right? How do we channel at-risk youth towards socially, economically, individually productive opportunities? And so we're thinking about, we will be evaluating a program that targets this set of at-risk persons aged 17 to 29, attempts to build up their capacities in terms of technical skills and soft skills, and then actually place them into the labor market for an experience. I'll tell you a little bit more about that program in a little bit. But ideally, when we're thinking about evaluating any program or looking at any target group, we'd like to know a little bit about this group, right? This is the frustration with data that's been expressed a couple times. Here, sort of at an aggregate level, we know that these guys are very much at risk. Qualitatively, we know they face a lot of challenges, but we don't know very much about them specifically. We have a baseline conducted by the project, which can tell us a little bit about the group. So rather than actually show you the results of that baseline, I'm going to skip through a few of these, and I'm going to summarize them for you very quickly. Basically, what we see is we have a group of persons that have very low formal education. So about half of the persons living in the area that this project is serving have not completed secondary school. We have sort of a range of occupations, but many of them are things like day laborers, other types of casual labor. So we have these kinds of relatively insecure, precarious jobs. We have a healthy amount of distrust of the private sector. So one of the things that we've learned in sort of qualitative work with this population is that they feel very discriminated against. And so we ask them, how much do you trust the private sector? And about a quarter say absolutely not at all. We asked about attitude towards violence, attitudes towards some soft skills such as self-control. And the way that these questions were asked, if I'm insulted, I may lose control, you have good reason to think that this is not going to get you a great response. But even in this case, and similarly for the question on violence, we see, we have a fairly large proportion of the sample that was surveyed for this particular exercise, which is not representative, saying, if I'm insulted, I might react negatively. I would kill to defend, and things like this. So a big frustration here, of course, is that we don't have a representative sample, and we're asking these sort of questions about participation in violence in fairly awkward ways. So one of the things that we're doing with this project, with support from the Jobs and the FCV groups here at the World Bank, is investing quite heavily in producing sort of tools and instruments to measure the kinds of sensitive, difficult to capture issues that we're particularly interested. So, how much are these people actually participating in criminality, in violence? How uniform is that in the population? How are they in terms of mental health? How are they in terms of soft skills? And the idea is that using this project in Honduras and some related work will actually be able to build a toolkit that can then be taken to other contexts and used with projects that are targeting youth that are similarly at risk to understand some of these more fundamental issues that have been addressed in the earlier presentations. And we're also doing quite a lot of work to develop sort of a crime monitoring system, if you will. So in places that, like Liberia, where there's no administrative data, or where maybe the administrative data only really captures the most severe events, what can we do to sort of better understand the geography of crime in time and in space? So great. But what are we going to do with all of this data? So in just a couple of minutes, I want to illustrate to you the sort of program design and the study design that we're using in Honduras. And so this is work that will be starting has been ongoing for a while in terms of preparation, but is starting in earnest over the next couple of months, and borrows a lot from the presentations that we've had so far today. So we have this overall objective defined with the government of reducing crime and violence through improving employability, employment, for at-risk youth aged 17-29, specifically those that are not in school, not strongly attached to the labor market. So one of the first things we want to do is learn about these people. So we're going to go out and actually conduct a census in the project areas, figure out exactly who these people are, figure out what is their mental health status, ask them questions about their soft skills, ask them questions about violence and criminality, and map their social networks to create sort of a very solid understanding of who are we attempting to serve, what are their needs, and what is the structure of this population. So then, the next step in our study, and this is going to be an experimental study in RCT, is sort of getting the word out there. And this is a challenging step, right? Because we want to attract not only the sort of best, those persons that would knock on the door anyway, but we want to have at-risk persons come and participate in this program so that we can really hope to have this effect on violence and criminality. And we need 2 eligible persons to apply for each slot so that we can go through a process of random assignment where we take our eligible persons and we put them into one of our 3 study arms. So we have 2 different types of treatment, which I'll explain in a second. We have a control group. And of course, as Sarah mentioned, assigning persons to the study in this manner then gives us a basis later on for attributing any difference across the groups directly to the program itself. We have a baseline survey, of course, to collect even more detailed information about the study participants, their families, and their social networks again. And then we begin our intervention. So we have a fairly intensive 1-year, 6 months to 1 year intervention, beginning with a training package comprising sort of remedial education, technical and vocational skills training, soft skills, and then building on or drawing from the experiences that we heard about today, we're integrating this group-based cognitive behavioral therapy component to help participants, let's say, better identify those harmful thoughts and behaviors and disrupt those very same thoughts and behaviors that may lead to negative outcomes. And this is something that we're giving to both of our treatment groups. So this is sort of a basic treatment. In our second treatment group, we're overlaying this individual mentoring intervention, which is designed to reinforce some of the lessons that are learned through the soft skills treatment. So we want to see actually does providing youth with a positive role model, a life coach, individual mentors deepen some of these impacts. And then we move on to placing youth directly in the local private sector. So trying to address in some way that sort of sense of discrimination that youth feel, or the barriers to accessing their local labor market. This gives them an opportunity to practice and to further develop some of the skills learned. And in addition, the second treatment group continues to receive this mentoring intervention. So we have two variants of this program, which I think you see has a lot of similarities to what was earlier discussed today. And we'll be testing both of these. And of course, concluding after some time, we'd like to wait longer, but because of the exigencies of the project itself, we have 18 months after the beginning of our program to basically see what happens in terms of violence and criminality, labor market outcomes, soft skills, and general sort of mental and physical well-being. So, hopefully we're about to start. Hopefully in about a year's time, we can come back, we can share with you the results of the census, the baseline, and kind of keep the stream of, keep the learning going. Thank you.
Eric, do I need to introduce you? Hi. So we have now Eric, who's also an economist in DEC-IE, and you're going to talk about, we don't have the title of your presentation, but we know.
Here we go.
Yeah, that's
now we have one. In the interest of time, I'll try to go through my talk really quickly so we can at least have some time for discussion. What I wanted to do today is basically to complement what some of my colleagues here have done by focusing on something more practical. That is, we've heard from the different presentations how doing impact evaluations in fragile and conflict-affected situations is really important. But how do we do them? And what kind of challenges do we run into? And do we actually even need to do them? Can we do these kind of studies in much safer areas? And the answer to this question, first of all, is that we actually do. We do need to do these impact evaluations in more dangerous areas. And the reasons are twofold. One, by definitions, these settings have peculiar characteristics, meaning that whatever we want to study there, we can only study it there. We cannot, whatever results we get from other contexts are not necessarily applicable to fragile and conflict-affected settings. So that's one reason. The other reason is that the kind of interventions that are carried out usually they have specific objectives, which include violence prevention and peace building, if you're also thinking about countries that are coming out of civil war. And so in evaluating the efficacy and effectiveness of these programs, these elements actually are key. So you can only evaluate this program with respect to those other, not just development outcomes, but also these conflict prevention and peace building objectives. And because these things are so specific to fragile and conflict and violence affected settings, that's what makes the case for doing these impact evaluations in those settings. And I don't need to tell you this, you've heard that there are some interesting studies coming in a pipeline. There are still few, we still need more evidence. And so based on what we know so far, there are a set of challenges that we are going to be running into as we try to expand these type of studies. And so right here, I'll focus only on 4 and perhaps share some thoughts on how we can overcome those challenges. The first challenge is that doing programs in fragile and conflict-affected environments, or at least these programs that have conflict prevention and peace-building objectives, they tend to be to have sort of an unpredictable nature. They tend to be changes that are dictated by the evolution of the situation on the ground. And that kind of really runs counter on how we do impact evaluations. With impact evaluations, we need some kind of predictability. We need to make sure that the treatments we want to test are going to be consistent throughout. And yet, the reality of the settings are such that the changes can be improvised. And then that, of course, can have an implications for the design you have and for the things you're trying to study. The populations might change. They might completely enroll other populations that have nothing to do with the characteristic they try to target at the beginning. So how do you deal with these problems? One, if you have very solid partnerships with the client, you probably wouldn't sort of be caught off guard with the changes in program interventions or in selecting new sites and new beneficiaries. You'll be warned. But that's not enough. Some of the changes might really be due to the changes on the conditions on the ground. If the areas where the programs were working happen to be attacked by an armed group and the program needs to go somewhere else, that's something they have no control over. You have to oblige. So that's one. Maintain strong partnerships with the clients. The second thing is have candid discussions about why the changes are happening and whether those changes are necessary. We've had to deal with this in the past months where the program felt they needed to change some interventions, and yet we had discussions with them and see how we can alleviate some of the concerns they had about the original design, and in the end, we ended up saving the interventions and the impact evaluations. And thirdly, we need to be sensitive to what they are saying and what they want to do. And therefore, our design, our impact evaluations design have to be very flexible, be able to adapt to those conditions. And so if you had a 4-arm experiment and the changes they are suggesting is that you kill 2 of the treatment arms and you only keep 2, then make the call of whether having an experiment with only 2 treatment arms is better than not having one at all. So that's sort of the first challenge that often comes and we have to deal with. The second challenge is that one of randomization. I'm sure you've heard this word many times. And so for us researchers, this is actually key to our ability to identify the effect of programs. And so we need to randomize programs to individuals. And yet, this can be a fraught exercise. Sometimes there's sort of political interference by local leaders who want programs to go to specific individuals, and so meaning you can't really do it as the way you want it. There are some ethical concerns. Program don't want to they feel like by randomizing, you're excluding programs to those who need it. It's not exactly that, but that's a perception these kind of approaches can lead to. And then there are also logistical challenges. By definition, when you're randomizing, you have to follow the protocols that the randomization results lead to you. So if it means that village that is located at 100 kilometers is the village that is going to receive the program, then the program wanted to do the intervention in a village that is at 10 kilometers, then they have to go to 100 kilometers, and that's a problem. So how do you deal with these issues? First, you have to do some conflict analysis beforehand. And understand how these randomization techniques might influence what you're doing on the ground and perhaps even lead to conflict. And here I'll give you an example. In Liberia, for example, what happened is, and it, in fact is Julian Coulter, Chris Blattman, other study in Liberia. So they were giving programs basically to former combatants. And they needed to randomize. And they were sort of former combatants of different ranks, right, from the corporals to the generals. So they made a decision that if we exclude some of the generals from the program, this is going to spell trouble. So instead of excluding them from the program, they gave the program to all of the generals. and they excluded them from the study. And so they focused the study only to those middle-level soldiers who some of them could afford not to get a program and not make a big deal out of it. So these are the kinds of sort of sensitivity one needs to be attentive to and be able to do the study even in difficult conditions like this. Third, there are some very specific thoughts I had, but we can discuss them in some other time. The third problem or challenge that we often run into is one of attrition, right? And by attrition, we mean you start with a group of participants in a study, and over time, you lose some of them. You lose villages. Attrition is actually unavoidable because sometimes if conflict comes, people are going to run away. You can't stop them, and you lose your treatment and control group, or at least some of them. And so how do you mitigate this problem? Very quickly, one, you probably need to start with a bigger sample, larger sample, because you can be sure that you'll be losing participants as the study progresses. And so hopefully, by the end of the study, you'll still have a sample that is large enough to allow you to do some analysis. There are also some creative things you can do. Sometimes we waste a lot of opportunity to do a good study by focusing on larger clusters. Whereas if we break them into smaller clusters, we can increase our sample and power to be able to detect the effect that way. And so the last challenge, and I'm going to try to stop here since we're running out of time, is the data. Data, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is, and yet it's a very, very fraught endeavor in conflict-affected situations. One is some areas might be inaccessible. I just cannot tell you. I've experienced some of that myself, as you can see here. You go to a village, the village doesn't exist anymore. It's on a map, but it actually doesn't exist. You go in some houses, it's just an empty house waiting for you. And some villages might not even be accessible at all. And so you have to sort of figure out a way to get there. And then to that, you add the sensitive nature of the questions we're asking, right? You're asking about violence, gender-based violence, participation in crime, and some people might not even reveal that information because they feel that it's gonna incriminate them. And so all of these issues are really problematic because if you don't have good data, then you cannot ascertain the impact of your program correctly. It's pretty much a wasted effort if you don't have good data. So what do? Very quickly, one of the things we have to do is to try to collect data as frequently as possible. I think Laura and others mentioned how important that is. So even if your study end up being sort of discontinued before the end of it, at least you have some data in the interim that you can look at. Use electronic data collection. Even in fragile environments, it's actually something that is done relatively easily. It requires low skill level. And so it's something that can really save time and effort. And finally, invest in good field coordinators. This is something we really invest in a lot in DIME, and I'll be happy to talk about it in the Q&A on how we do it and how you can learn from it yourself. So I'll stop here. I hope we still have at least 5 minutes for discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks a lot. I think what I suggest is, given that we are running out of time, why don't we have a few questions from the audience, and then we'll request the discussants to maybe in 1 minute each, yeah. Very briefly, react to the presentations and then also address some of the questions. So why don't we start with the questions, please?
Yeah, good afternoon.
Yes, please, sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, happy to see Mr. Mahendra.
Hi, how are you?
Yes, this was the most boring event today at the World Bank. It was for professionals talking about starter research and whatever. We are here as civil society. We wanted a language, and when we are here, we want a language that everybody understands. It was the most boring session since we started on Monday. Anyway, last year, Mr. Mahendra, we talked about conflicts. I started these conflicts and violence. My son was killed in Kenya, so I've been involved. I'm not a professional like you with data, big data or small data. I spoke as a civil society and as a non-profit. So I sent you several letters. We had discussions how we would collaborate, and you never responded. Maybe you thrashed my letter because it didn't have technical information in it, or data or big data. But I think you received it and we've talked so much about it. So when we're talking here as civil society, me, I'm talking as a civil, you are professionals. How do we work with you? Because if you received my letters, you never acknowledged. I didn't know where I was going. My project is in Kenya, and I was taking message to other African countries. So when we come here, this is the second time we are talking about with your experts, which I didn't even understand one thing. I was taking coffee. So how do we came here, all of us, civil society, government, to talk about how do we collaborate? If the World Bank is collaborating with the United Nations and I send you a letter and you don't respond, even if it's not professional, say something. What is the something? That's why we are meeting here. So can you answer my question? What happened with my letter, if it was worthy or if I was not a professional to work with me? So, and again, this was the most boring session in the world.
Thanks for that comment. And it's you are right in the sense that this session is meant more for practice for specialists. It's a very technical session. You are absolutely right, and this doesn't cater so much to civil society representatives. So my apologies for that. And we'll continue the conversation. We did have a follow-up conversation in my office, and my promise to you was, when I go to Kenya, I will let you know, and I would like to visit your project and see what you're doing on the ground. And I'll keep that promise. But if you remember, we did have a follow-up conversation in my office, and I'm more than happy to have another one soon. So, but unfortunately or fortunately, this session is meant more for technical specialists who are researchers. Trust me, it took a lot for me to focus on this because I do not belong to that breed either. So it took me a lot to focus on the technical aspects of this. But we have other sessions which I'm sure you'll find very useful.
I had to come because this is my
So there is.
I knew what you were saying, but I just didn't want. I wanted to talk to you in front so that you understand. We are here together, even the experts. I have a son who is an expert. Somebody else is an expert. So we come here to gather together, whether I listen or I don't understand. It's okay, but even if it was for the experts, I guess it was only the World Bank staff that was speaking. Maybe I don't know, but it's okay.
So our apologies for that. And in the forum, there are sessions which has something for everyone. This one, I fully agree with you. This one is a very technical session, and even for me, as I said. So apologies, and let's have a follow-up conversation. And as I mentioned, when I go to Kenya, I would be delighted to visit your project and see what amazing things you are doing on the ground that you told me about when we met in my office. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. Actually, my question is for Marcus Holman, if I'm not mistaken. Marcus, right? You spoke about Honduras. Oh, that doesn't work. Does it? All right. So I just wanted to, if you could elaborate just a little bit more about the program. I'm really interested in what you're doing in countries in the Northern Triangle, such as El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and in a more broader sense, Latin America, where you see where 1 in every 5 young people are neither working nor studying. So as you may know, in these countries, we have a large informal sector and we have a diminishing formal sector. So what are your plans on training them? Because right now they can only access the informal sector, and afterwards they never really actually build skills to enter the formal sector. But even if they do, the formal sector might not be able to absorb them. So if you can elaborate a little bit more about that, I would be really glad to hear more about it. Thank you.
Yeah, so not to dodge the question, but let me respond sort of briefly, and then maybe we can have a follow-up conversation outside to also get some of your perspective. So the point of this intervention in Honduras is exactly to facilitate that transition from sort of low-quality informal labor into formal labor markets. And so what is the program that we're implementing is based on something called the Youth Build model. Youth Build was started in the United States, is now implemented in, I think, 16 different countries worldwide. But it's a model that's never actually been subject to a randomized controlled trial. And that's actually not what we're doing either. We're taking this model, which has these elements of sort of remedial education, technical and vocational training, and some soft skills training, and we're adapting that by drawing in some of the lessons and the approaches that were discussed from, in particular, from Liberia and from Chicago today. So principally this idea of cognitive behavioral therapy and mentoring. And the justification for those things is really that if you look at the kinds of results that these more traditional labor market interventions have had, where you provide this technical vocational training, they're pretty disappointing, right? You have short-run impacts, if any, and typically these things sort of benefit the relatively well off to begin with, so not the populations that you're speaking about. And so what we're trying to do with this particular program is address specifically the needs of those persons that are in the informal sector, that are at risk, that are relatively poorly off in a generally poor context, and basically see if we can take some of these established models, tweak them a little bit based on what we've learned from other settings, and see if that is something that can produce outcomes in, first, the short run, because we're restricted by the length of the project, but ideally we would be able to go back and then sort of observe the long run trajectories as well. So maybe we can continue. Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
My name is Kurt Rhodes. I've been in the Middle East since 1980, working in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, northern Iraq, all your favorite vacation spots. This means, of course, that since the 1980s, I have been privileged to know Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and in Syria and in Jordan, Iraqi refugees in Syria and Jordan, Somali refugees in Jordan, and now Syrian refugees. Everyone gets a turn at being a refugee, it seems. Probably the most outstanding characteristic that we observe, and that all of you touched on, and bravo on you, is that the first thing that happens to a person whose life is disturbed by conflict and violence is the destruction of their relationship structure. You're alone. And observing the various things that we talked about, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or any other therapy, whether it's multiple therapies, short-term therapies, to establish a relationship with another person is absolutely critical. In terms of the context, the last gentleman who spoke, the context, I think it would be wise for you to talk more about the context of your interventions, because the context really is everything. At my age, I remember older studies more than I remember recent studies. There was a study done, started a long-term perspective study in the 50s with Native Hawaiians whose lives were being disturbed by drugs and alcohol. And in the 90s, so 40 years later, and the study's not ended, they reported on some of the results. If you had at a minimum of 3 weeks of a mentoring relationship early in your life, that was a predictor of the trajectory that you would not be in prison 40 years later. So you're holding in your hands some very, very powerful stuff. You know, we surround it with a lot of fancy language, and fancy language and articulation is very important to have so we can tease things out and understand better. But again, I would encourage you to talk with us more about the context in which you overcame some of the things to maintain those relationships. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another session here? We're starting now? Okay, so I guess it will have to end this way because 3:30, that starts at 3:30. So our apologies for that. We didn't have time for discussions, neither did we give time for our discussions. At the same time, the presentations were amazing, and I felt that way that, I don't know what was to come in the Q&A session, but the richness and the messaging of the presentations was really impactful, and we are going to carry this work forward, hopefully. So I think all the speakers managed to convince us that we really need to, there's an agenda for action, and we need to do something. And that's our commitment to you, that what you may have missed by way of a continued discussion here for a few more minutes, we'll more than make up by doing something about it. And we'll continue the conversation in other sessions. So thank you very much, and a huge round of applause for all of our speakers. I think what we'll do is we'll have I discussed with Alice. Laura, if we can organize a meeting, a follow-up meeting with the discussants, with a few people, and then see where we take this forward.
The three of us are going to be traveling on mission to Honduras and Congo, but in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, exactly. Let's do that, please. Yes.
Thank you.